Welcome to Shielded, the podcast dedicated to helping Florida's first responders understand the laws that affect their work and their lives. We bring clear answers, practical tips, and stories to help you when you need it most. If you're a first responder in Florida, this is your playbook. Be sure to check out all of our resources at bicklerlaw.com. I'm your host, Paolo Longo, and I'm here with my partner, Jeff Bickler. At Bickler & Longo, this is what we do. Now let's get into it. So welcome back to Shielded, the First Responder Lawcast, where we talk about laws that protect those who protect us. I'm Paolo Longo, an attorney and partner at Bickler & Longo, and today is the first part of a multi-part series that we're going to do on PTSD and mental health coverage for Florida's first responders. We're going to talk about how the law evolved, the tragedy that forced reform, and a lot of the new challenges that we still face. And joining me, as always, is the person who helped write much of that story, my partner, Jeff Bickler. Thanks for being here. And this is a topic that really, I think, defines and strikes at the heart of what we do in our practice.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Paolo. And, as always, it's great to be here with you. This is a topic that just recently has even got a lot more traction. So I think it's important that we're going to cover this and give people some context and some history, about how this all evolved. So yeah, we can jump right into it. It's after 5, so I've got my cocktail here. I know you don't have one. I'm having a cava, a nice little alcohol substitute. So hopefully that'll get the discussion flowing.
Yeah, I mean, but most people, and I won't say most people, but I'll say most people, but most first responders don't even actually understand or know that they have coverage for a mental nervous injury, especially up to and including PTSD. So let's talk about sort of, the history of that and how that evolved.
Yeah. So, Florida was like most states in that we didn't recognize, injuries that were considered purely mental. That's actually the industry parlance for mental injuries without a physical injury. And this, it goes back to common law days, English common law, that without a physical injury, a person could not claim damages, right? And then, of course, our workers' comp system is overlays and replaces any common law rights and remedies that a person has available to them. So most states, when they passed workers' compensation legislation, did not cover mental injuries. And so this is something that, it just was routine in our practice representing first responders, that we knew there was no way we could make a claim for purely mental injuries. It became obvious to me as I had started doing this work and had been in it for, 10, 15 years that, there were an awful lot of our firefighters and law enforcement officers who were suffering horribly from mental disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, severe depression, lots of things that, alcohol abuse, substance abuse, all these things that we see so frequently in our practice, just because of the nature of the employment, the stress of the job, and what they face.
Yeah, and I mean, they're rolling up on bad calls and they're seeing all kinds of death and accidents and things like that. I mean, it seems like obvious that these kind of things would be covered for first responders.
Yeah, well, and that was always kind of my thought process on it too. Like I could never understand in my mind why we didn't recognize these claims for the first responders in particular. But that was the state of the law. And so, up until 2007, there was no coverage whatsoever for a mental claim, even for a first responder. Not to use the legal parlance, but, a mental disorder, whether it's depression, anxiety, PTSD, all of the above, there was no way to make a claim for that prior to 2007. And we had, we had all kinds of just horrible cases that begged for some type of legislative reform. And one in particular that I will never forget, involved a Volusia County firefighter, he was in his 30s at the time. And Volusia County then had single man fire stations. So they had guys that were manning fire stations all by themselves.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, it was like the dark ages, right? And So he got called out to a traffic fatality, and he was the first man on the scene. He arrived alone, and it was a decapitation of a child. And his mother was there. And, you can only imagine the horrors of that type of a scene. And this young firefighter what are you going to do with this? How do you even know how to approach something like that?
Right.
Just the sheer, panic of the mother, the gruesome nature of the injuries. I mean, all of it. And so this guy, and it took 10, 15 minutes for anybody else to even show up at that scene. So it was really just horrible. And needless to say, he completely decompensated after that. I mean, he was not able to return to work, started drinking heavily. The union sent him over to us for representation. And really there was nothing that we could do about the mental nervous issue because the law didn't provide anything. But
right, because he didn't have a physical injury of himself.
Correct,
right? He wasn't injured physically, so therefore any mental nervous injury that he had that was without a physical injury, there was just nothing. There was no coverage available for him.
Exactly. And again, this is pre 2007. I mean, I want to say it was actually mid 90s when we got that case. But, anyway, there was nothing we could do about that. But what was interesting, he was still employed, even though, he was burning sick time and whatever. And he developed a very severe cardiac issue after this. And so what we ended up doing was pursuing a cardiac claim for him. And we were able then, because of that cardiac claim, to make a claim, for the mental nervous condition. And the doctors even said there was probably some relationship between these two things, right?
Right. Of course, it's natural. I mean, you can have the stress of the job is going to affect the body. That's the whole point of the cardiac presumption to begin with, right?
Yeah. And I mean, something that horrific, I mean, could easily trigger like even a heart attack or something. I mean, that would not be unusual. So anyway, we were able at length to kind of connect the dots and get coverage for this guy. And he ended up being permanently disabled, primarily because of the mental nervous issue. Right. But what that really highlighted for me, again, was the problem with the law and the fact that we didn't have any type of coverage at all for mental nervous claims where there was not a physical injury. And so at that stage, this story and others started to kind of trickle up to Tallahassee, and we got some momentum ultimately for passage of legislation that would allow for at least medical coverage. And
right, and that's the law that you're referring to that came about in 2007.
Correct. So in 2007, the legislature passed this statute. The reference is Florida statute section 112.1815. It did provide for medical coverage for what is referred to as mental nervous injuries, right? And it does, and the statute doesn't go any further in defining that. It just covers mental nervous injuries. And it's very interesting in the way it's written, but it really wasn't all that effective for obvious reasons. And most people didn't know to take advantage of it. They didn't know anything about the law.
Right, and then you got to figure out what's a mental nervous injury, right?
Exactly.
I mean, we're litigating everything from anxiety to personality disorders to bipolar to
depression, even substance abuse issues, addiction issues. I mean, exactly. What is mental nervous injury? And to this day, we still don't. It's not defined in the statute, and it's not been defined by the case law.
Right. I mean, I guess it's a mental nervous injury is something that's not an actual physical injury, right?
Yeah.
But we're splitting hairs at that point because, like you said, the physical manifestation of the mental nervous injury, you get cardiac claims and all kinds of other physical ailments that accompany this. And then the problems that come with substance abuse and drug abuse and alcoholism and things like that. I mean, that takes a toll on your physical body too. So when they're saying mental nervous injury, I don't know. I guess the legislature tries hard, but sometimes they don't get it right. Right.
Well,
so we have.
Yeah. I mean, but I would say, Paolo, because it's such a broad umbrella, I mean, it leaves a lot of wiggle room for, for coverage and for interpretation for sure. And, we've taken a position through our firm that, almost anything you can imagine that could be determined to be defined as a mental nervous injury claim, like a substance abuse issue or an addiction problem, those things could conceivably be covered and probably should be covered. But the coverage that exists under that subsection for just medical care is so limited that most people just don't take advantage of it. As
Right,
you
because
referenced.
the one glaring thing that is not included is wage loss benefits, right?
Right,
So if
right,
somebody, like this firefighter that comes up on this horrible scene that ends up with, debilitating or disabling PTSD, the doctor says, okay, I need you out of work for 6 weeks, or I need you to go to a treatment facility in-house for 30 days or something like that to get help. These guys and gals aren't getting paid while they're out, right?
right,
So
right.
what's the incentive to file the claim if I'm going to be out of work for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days and I can't get paid, right? I've got mouths to feed. I've got a
Mhm.
family at home. I've got a mortgage to pay. Am I going to file that claim?
No. Well, yeah, it's
No.
actually a disincentive. I mean, it's like, oh, I can go get medical care for this, but I'm not going to get paid lost wages, and I got to go through the whole workers' comp rigmarole to boot, and I got to deal
Right.
with an adjuster, and they get to pick the doctor, and all of the typical issues that we see in workers' comps. I mean, even with the passage of that law, most people simply went to their own doctor. Right. They would
Right.
go through their group health. If they needed medical care, they would go through their own group health. They wouldn't bother with a workers' comp claim.
Right. And then by the time we got a case like that, they had decompensated to the point where wage loss was the essential issue,
Right.
right?
And they're
I mean,
losing their jobs. Right. I
and
mean,
they're losing their
yeah.
jobs, right? Because the statute covered them on paper, right? And the legislature could pat themselves on the back for helping first responders, but in reality, it punished them in practice, right? Because
Yeah.
if we got somebody, if we got one of these guys early enough to get them medical care, most of them would go back to work, right? But because the system wasn't designed to help them in any real meaningful way,
Right.
nobody would file claims. And then it was like by the time we would start getting calls from these folks, they were to the point where they're going out on disability or retiring or worse.
Yeah.
That we had suicide cases and things like that because people aren't getting help, right?
Oh, that was, yeah, all over the place. I mean, it's recognized. I mean, suicide is still a massive problem in the first responder community. I mean, we all know that. I mean, there are all the studies that have been done and continue to be done on this problem. And so that's so often the case is, the first responder does not get the medical care they need. This languishes for years. It becomes career ending, disabling, even potentially deadly, right? And so this was the dynamic at play, even after the passage of this legislation in 2007. And I got to say, it's always this is always so frustrating for me, and this because I've been involved in the legislative process for so long. You have a good idea and you want to protect this community, but it gets watered down to such a degree that sometimes what they pass is almost useless or worse. And our current law is an example of that. I know we'll talk about that more later on another.
Yeah, but I mean, as far as the original iteration of this statute, I mean, looking back now, I mean, it's almost like a disincentive to file a claim, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
mean,
they're saying clearly we'll give you medical care, but we're not going to cover your lost wage compensation. Right.
Yeah. So who's going to use that law? And I mean, I'm quite frankly, looking back on all those years when we were fighting these cases, that I'm surprised that we got as many as we did.
Well, yeah. I mean, we're pretty successful in litigating the medical only claims for sure. But usually, again, it's like you reference, it was somebody that had gone so far in their career and had been untreated for such a long period of time that they were really in a crisis at that stage. And that's not what we ever want. I mean, clearly what we're looking to do with our clients is get them early intervention, the best possible medical care, let them get back to work and complete their career on their own terms. Right.
Right. And I mean, I mean, and I tell people this all the time. When I have the opportunity to speak, to this population, to our first responders, the overwhelming majority of our clients that call us early in this process, the overwhelming majority of these folks go back to work. I
Oh,
mean, it really is,
100%.
it
Right.
really is a small percentage of people that either retire out or go line of duty disability or can't go back to work. But I think that goes maybe to, some of the culture. I mean, do you think that law, when it came out in 2007, was a little bit of a reflection of the culture? Because at that time, it was sort of the, tough it out mentality.
Suck it up,
So the law,
buttercup. Yeah.
right. So the law maybe was sort of a reflection of the society that we lived in at the time and said, well, I mean, who's filing these claims? Well,
Right.
nobody's filing them. So do we really need a law?
Well, yeah. Well, and it's funny that you say that because what you always get on the other side of the equation, if you're talking about the management or employers that have concerns about this type of legislation, they're always like, well, so many people are going to just take advantage of this and file frivolous claims, and that just does not happen, right? I mean, you and I can both count on one hand the number of frivolous PTSD cases that we've been.
I mean, I can count on one hand because there are zero.
Yeah,
I mean, how do you even? I've never had
yeah.
a case
I mean,
where that was even an allegation.
Yeah, who wants to go through the nonsense, right? And the fight involved in a workers' compensation claim, if it doesn't have merit. And this is such a rarity that it's a red herring, really, when the League of Cities or a big municipal employer raises this issue of, we got all these frauds in the system and they're going to try to wash out on a disability retirement. It's just,
yeah, I've never met anybody that pretended to have PTSD.
no.
I mean, I don't know anybody that would fake that. But yeah, but we heard that in Tallahassee, right? We heard that.
Oh yeah,
During the
we heard it.
legislative
Yeah,
process.
in the in the session leading up to the passage of the law in 2007, and then again when they tried to modify the law after 2016. So
Right.
it's just very typical of what you see, and unfortunately, you end up many times with laws that are difficult to enforce, or laws that don't really effectuate much change or provide much protection. So
Right.
that's where we have to get creative in terms of our representation.
Yeah. And, going back to the legislative process back in 2007, you get those legislators that say, well, there aren't any claims being filed. So why do we need a law to protect this?
Right.
Right. I mean, the law's working as it is. They don't need a special provision because nobody's filing claims.
Yeah.
Well, they're not filing claims because, of the stigma attached to mental nervous injuries with law enforcement officers and first responders, right? They're supposed to be supermen and tough guys and superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
They're trained to handle this kind of stuff, and they don't need these kind of things, right? I mean, that's sort of the mental.
Well, I mean, yeah, the stigma is one piece of it for sure, Paul. The other piece of it is just lack of knowledge, right? And just the fact that the vast majority of our first responders don't even know that they have these protections, in Florida statutes. So, you and I both spend a great deal of our time trying to educate folks about, this law, and also the Heart Bill and other statutory protections. But there is such a vast amount of ignorance when it comes to these types of injury claims that that's another reason that most people don't take advantage of it. Right.
Right. So then, following the 2000 statute, right, we start getting more of these cases. The stigma sort of seems to be coming off a little bit, right? That it's not such a big deal.
Yeah.
Right. There's a little more of an understanding. We start seeing these claims, but we keep running into this same wall of, well, what happens if the doctor says I can't work, right? So then there's this continual reticence to bring forward claims, right? You do get we did have some clients that were like, look, my mental health is more important to me. My life, my marriage, my family, my kids, are more important to me than anybody, than any stigma or anything like that.
Right.
But those cases were few and far between, right? I mean, the overwhelming number of our clients that wanted to come forward with this stuff, we had to end up backdooring the mental case, like you said on that other one, having a physical injury and getting care that way instead of just making a straight claim for a mental nervous injury, because it was just too difficult legally to overcome the hurdles that were set forth.
Yep, 100%. And it's funny, and I don't know, when you reference the notion of the stigma, and how it has lightened up over the last decade, I would say. A lot of that has to do with the understanding in the military community about how this is so impactful, right? So there's been some translation of that understanding and on the military side over to our first responders. And in a lot of ways, sometimes our first responders experience even worse things than some of our soldiers that come back with post-traumatic stress disorder. These are traumatic events that they witness over and over again, and it's not like there's even a limited time period. Some of our clients are 30-year firefighters that have had countless tragic events that they've had to run on. So I do think that there's a better public awareness now about the need for this type of care and treatment, and also providing compensation for folks who have to go out and work.
Maybe it's a generational thing too, right? As the last generation of first responders, is retiring out, you've got a whole new group, in the last 10 years, right? Where we've got, I don't even know what the heck they're called, millennials, right?
Yeah.
For lack of a better word. You get police officers in their 30s now instead of in their 60s, where it's more of a norm to say, hey, look, this is what's going on.
Yeah, I'm not okay. I need help, or whatever. So there's been an institutional change on that level too, I think. So there's been an awful lot that's happened, since the 2007 law went into effect, and then again the attempt to modify it in 2018 following the Pulse shooting and the Parkland shooting, and I know we're going to talk about that as well.
Yeah, and so that's probably a good place to segue, right? Is because that from 2007 until 2016, we're just kind of muddling through these kinds of claims.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing the best we can for our first responders, but with the law the way that it is, or that it was very difficult to pursue these claims, because certainly there was no wage loss. But then, right, 2016 comes, and that's sort of the earthquake, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned that earlier, and that's the Pulse shooting, right? And fortunately and unfortunately, that was right here in our backyard, right here in Orlando, right? So we were on the ground, literally day one with our clients there.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll be I think that's a good transition right there to segue.
Okay. I think that's right, Paul. And when you think about it, this is sort of the natural evolution of the law anyway. This is how things typically go. This moves at a very slow, at a very slow pace, and we understand that. When a problem is recognized in the law, it maybe takes litigation to change things, and then you've got to have legislative change in Tallahassee at the state level. And then you've got to recognize, well, maybe we didn't do enough here, right? And we've got to do something more. We've got to modify that. And so, it's just part of the natural, I think, life of the law and how things progress. So, I think it's a great stopping point here on this part of the discussion, and then we can pick it up.
Yeah. And unfortunately, what happens a lot of times is that it takes a tragedy to get the legislature to do anything. Yeah. Right. And so, good, bad, or ugly, that's what we got. But next week episode, we're going to talk, really, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into the Pulse shooting. We're going to get into one of our clients' cases that he was there at the Pulse shooting. He was inside that building. He was there for the cleanup. We're going to go through his experience and how that sort of became a catalyst for the new version of the statute that we have now. But in the meantime, if this podcast has meant anything to you, if it's helped at all, please like and share. Please, tell a friend to watch. And until next time, thank you, and for all you guys do, and stay safe.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for listening to Shielded. At Bickler & Longo, this is what we do. We've represented thousands of first responders across the state of Florida. If you need assistance, don't wait. Please reach out. To learn more, head over to bicklerlaw.com or email us at info@bicklerlaw.com. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Bickler Law. And if you found today's episode to be helpful, please share it with a fellow first responder who might need to hear it. Until next time, stay safe and thank you for all you do.